Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the City of Everett Planning Commission meeting. This is Tuesday, March 3rd, 2015, and we'll start out with a roll call.
Chair Stewart.
Here.
Commissioner Holland.
Here.
Commissioner Sand.
Here.
Commissioner Adams.
Here.
Commissioner Jordison.
Here.
Thank you. Next, we will have approval of the minutes, and the commission will note we've got 2 sets of minutes. We were really ambitious last month and met for 3 Tuesdays in a row. So we have February 10th, 2015 meeting minutes. Has everyone had a chance to review them? And are there any questions or changes anybody would like to make? All right, do I hear a motion to approve the February 10th meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All right.
Commissioner Jordison.
I will vote yes.
Commissioner Adams.
Yes.
Commissioner Sand.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Chair Stewart.
All right, and our next set of meeting minutes was from February 17th, 2015. Any commission comments or changes? Do I hear a motion to approve?
Move to approve.
Second.
Commissioner Jordison.
I will abstain.
Commissioner Adams.
Yes.
Commissioner Sand.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Chair Stewart.
Yes. And now is an opportunity for reports from any of the commission members. We'll start down at your end.
I went to the I-502 facility a couple of weeks ago. A couple of the other commissioners reported on it already. It was quite small in my estimation. I think the grow room, it looked to be only about as big as a 3 or 4 car garage. It was very clean, very high-tech, and very chemical-free. I found it to be fairly unobtrusive to the surrounding area, so that was my impression of it. I have nothing else to report.
Commissioner Adams?
No report.
Commissioner Sand?
No report.
Commissioner Holland?
No report tonight.
And I don't have any report tonight either. Are there some staff comments before we?
Yes. Dave Koenig, planning staff, and since support staff is here also, I attended the Port Commission on February 10th, and the Port approved the development agreement and the waterfront place project that council had approved on January 21st. And the Port Commission asked that we pass on to those that were involved, including the Planning Commission, their thanks for the work that you put into it. So I wanted to do that formally tonight on the record. And they were very pleased with the cooperation between the Port and the city on working through that project. So I told them I'd pass it on to the Commission. On March 10th, we have a meeting for you, and I don't know if you have the packets up there. I know they're out. Did you, Kathy? Yeah. So we provided you the packets for the 10th. There's 3 items on there, including the student housing and a couple others, the boundary line adjustment, the gaps and intrusion thing, and one other. And then on the 17th, we plan on having a meeting on marijuana. So that will be the night that the code-related things on the marijuana, as we had talked about. So that's what we have coming up in March. And I don't have anything more.
Okay, thank you. We have one item on the agenda tonight, which is a workshop on our comprehensive plan update, and there's the marine port element, as well as the critical areas, policies, and regulations. So there'll be an opportunity for citizen comment during those discussions. So if there's any citizen who would like to comment on anything other than those two items, now you have a chance to speak. Seeing none, I think we'll move on to item number 1, which is a workshop on the 2015 to 2035 comprehensive plan update. And are we going to start with the marine port element?
Yes. Mary Cunningham Planning. In 2009, the Growth Management Act was amended to require port elements for the City of Seattle and City of Tacoma for their ports, and it made it optional for other ports that had operating revenues in excess of $20 million. And at this point, the Port of Everett has decided that they would like to pursue a port element as part of this comprehensive plan update, which is the time that the Growth Management Act allows that to occur. And they submitted an application for this amendment. And then staff has been working with them on the revisions to their first draft, and that's what's in front of you right now. It requires, before it's adopted by City Council, it requires port concurrence, so the Port Commission will have to adopt a resolution supporting the element before City Council can approve it. And the intent of these elements are to ensure that local land use decisions are made in consideration of the economic contributions of the international container ports, related industrial lands, and transportation systems. So there's two main areas that we're looking at as calling them the marine port core areas for this element that are related to the container shipping function. And this is the largest area that's along Port Gardner Bay, south of Everett Avenue, and west of the downtown and some of the more Rucker Hill residential neighborhoods down to about Pigeon Creek number 1. And this is the largest area, and it's just south of the Kimberly-Clark, former Kimberly-Clark Central Waterfront planning area. The other area that's part of this element is the Mount Baker Terminal. This is the rail barge pier that's associated with that terminal. It's located near the Mukilteo city limits at the far west end, southwest end of Everett, near the Mukilteo Tank Farm site. And it's used to barge containers from the port and then to put them on rail to go up to the Boeing plant up through Japanese Gulch. We've talked about having other port properties included in this designation, but right now none of them are actively being used directly associated with the container port area, like the Riverside Industrial Park. So in the future, if those areas do take on activity that's related to the container port and shipping activity, we could add them into this element. Or if the port acquires other properties, we could add those in later. The element starts off with an introduction that includes discussion of the location of these areas, the history of the port development, discusses existing facilities and operations, the economic impact of marine port activities, and a big list of related land use regulations and policies. It also includes a discussion about the Marine Terminals Master Plan, which was adopted by the port in 2008. And it looked at long-term expansion needs, or at least mid-range expansion needs for the Port of Everett, And one of the areas, and those are needed to keep pace with the changing shipping industry, the need for, there's bigger ships, and so they need larger berths, and there's increasing cargo volumes associated, and so and increasing handling equipment is needed. So this graphic is an excerpt from that plan that shows an expansion of the south terminal, which is down at the south end of that main Marine Corps area, north of the public access beach. The public access beach is down in here, and then this is port maintenance building that's real visible near that beach, and then this would be an expansion further to the north and west. The vision for the port element, or this Marine Corps area, is a strong and vibrant industrial marine port in the deep water portion of Port Gardner Bay, supported by appropriate capital facilities and infrastructure and an efficient truck and rail transportation network. And then there's two main goals that that the policies follow from. The first one is to preserve the marine port core area and protect the long-term function and viability of this area, to recognize the role that the port plays in regional employment and economic development. And we'll get into some of the policies of how we protect the long-term function of this area, and addressing some of the impacts that industrial port activities can have on neighboring areas. And the second goal is to identify, protect, and preserve the transportation infrastructure and services needed for efficient multimodal movement of goods. So first, I'm going to go through some of the policies that relate to the first of those goals, which was protecting that marine core area from adjacent land uses. And the policies talk about providing, protecting the container, industrial, rail-related uses and public access where it doesn't conflict, encouraging aggregation of land, giving priority to uses that support a large number of jobs rather than just like warehousing type uses. And there's several places in the policies where it talks about that any use of the former Kimberly-Clark property, if this expands, if the port takes on part of that in the future, would have to be consistent with the central waterfront plan. And that plan went through a pretty lengthy public hearing process. There was a lot of discussion related to that, and there are higher standards for development in that area than there are in this main port area, marine port area. So in some places along that marine port, there are more natural buffers where there's steeper hillsides and green belts that are between the port and the residential neighborhoods. But the policies say where natural buffers like that don't exist, adopt development standards to protect the livability of adjacent areas. And historically, one of the biggest areas of concern with some of the residential properties and others has been noise that's generated at the port. The city's noise regulations are based on the category of land use. And there's three categories of land use. Industrial fits in one category, commercial in the middle, and then residential. And sound limits are based on who's generating the sound, what zone you're in, and then who's receiving the sound. And so industrial developments are allowed to generate higher noise levels than residential areas. So conflicts can occur when you get residential uses adjacent to industrial areas. People may have some concerns about the the allowed limits in the city's noise ordinance. And one issue here is that a large part of the B3 zone goes right up to this area. The B3 zone's kind of in the middle commercial category in our current noise regulations. And so it can receive even higher, the noise levels at that receiving property can be higher than, in the residential properties that are just to the south. So we've been having discussions with the port about some possible mechanisms of dealing with these issues, recognizing that the port is allowed under the current noise regulations to generate those higher noise levels. The port has a hotline for noise, and they take complaints and try and work with property owners over time in a variety of methods. Those are policies in their marine terminals master plan that direct them to do that. And that's something we've done in the past through our SEPA reg policies. When we've had issues like with new residential development locating directly adjacent to a freeway where we know noise levels are really high, we've required those residential developments to do noise studies and do some extra building construction techniques so that interior noise levels in those units are reduced down to a level that meets what a federal standard or guideline is. And so that's something that we're looking at. We have policies in here that would require that noise attenuation in new residential and mixed-use buildings in transition areas near the port. And we still haven't figured out how far back, that should be, and that may, more detail may have to be delayed until the regulatory stage or until we look at our SEPA policies or downtown planned action, again, to see how we might implement this. The other thing we've talked about and is requiring notice on the title of these new developments near the port, if there are residential projects in that area, to just advise new owners and residents of the potential impacts associated with living near a marine port area that can generate higher noise levels than, say, what could occur in a residential area. And then something that's the city's doing right now is in the process of updating our noise ordinance. So some of our noise regulations may change, and some of the other jurisdictions like Seattle have started treating mixed-use zones similar to residential zones because they do have so many residences living there in terms of what types of noise levels can be on those receiving properties. And we're not sure how that's going to fall out at this point. So there may be some changes to those noise regulations we'll be looking at when we try and implement these policies. There's policies for allowing localized impacts such as outdoor storage, large building mass, and impervious surface area. And that contrasts somewhat with what is in the Central Waterfront Plan. So in the Central Waterfront Plan, which is further to the north, there are some restrictions on outdoor storage and large building mass, although it would still allow, container shipping terminals as outdoor storage type activity. And there's policies to collaborate with the port about these land use conflicts along the edges, and also related to their long-range planning efforts for their development program. And then the policies related to multimodal movements and trucks talk about, supporting improvements to the regional freight truck corridors and emphasizing the importance to those on the economy. preserving and enhancing heavy haul routes, and supporting and encouraging intermodal facilities and cargo transport via rail to minimize truck traffic, provided shoreline public access is provided and maintained. And there have been some issues recently along the waterfront where public access was closed by the railroad because of concerns about conflicts between public access and rail. And the city's goal would be to maintain public access in the future. Policies related to preserving and enhancing pavement along freight routes, prioritizing improvements that improve freight operations, keeping freight in mind when designing capital improvements like bridge heights and signal clearances, and coordinating with other agencies to seek funding and do joint projects. So that's all I have. Graham Anderson and Dennis Derrickson from the Port of Everett are here, and they can also answer questions if you have any specific questions about their marine terminals or any of the background information. Or
Would the port like to make any introductory statements, though? Okay.
Thank you, Port Commissioners. Graham Anderson, Port of Everett staff, good evening. And with me tonight, Dennis Derrickson, who's a consultant for the port, and I think a familiar face to you folks already. And Laura Gurley is also with the Port of Everett. She's coming on board as a planner with us down at the port. I just want to underscore Dave's thank you to the Planning Commission and also to the City Council from the Port Commission and Executive Director Les Reardon's that Dave mentioned occurred in the February meeting. All heartfelt thanks for your work, and so you need to know that that was something that was a point of emphasis at that meeting. No real testimony tonight, but certainly since it's a workshop format, wanted to offer a couple of comments. I want to thank Mary and Dave and City Planning staff for working collaboratively with us. This is kind of an exciting thing for the port because up until this point, our story, if you will, has been kind of interwoven into various chapters of the city's comp plan, but not specifically standing out as a separate chapter or referred to as a separate element. So this is really neat for us, and we're grateful to have the opportunity. And so our thanks to planning staff. It's likely that we'll continue to refine some of the language. We've talked to Mary a little bit about some of that, and she's alluded to that as well. So from what I understand, certainly there will be an opportunity for you, if there are additional comments or suggestions from the port, that you'll certainly see those going forward. So I think probably one of the significant things I can say is that we recognize that it is recognized we've got a pretty strong operating port right now in our marine terminal area, and it's adjacent, as Mary said, to residential areas and to mixed-use areas as well. And so it's the compatibility that we're really trying to fine-tune, making sure that we still have a robust and vibrant port and yet recognize how we can go about our operations in a way that's compatible, or as compatible as we can make them. So we recognize that challenge. So I think Denny's going to add a few comments tonight with regard to that. But we're pleased to be in this position to have a chance to tell our story a little bit in front of the Planning Commission. And so we're thankful to be here tonight. Denny?
Thank you, Graham. Dennis Derrickson, a consultant to the Port of Everett. Even though I've been a land use planner in this region now, this is starting my 44th year, and I keep trying to retire, but somebody told me I'd flunked retirement. So actually, even after all these years, what you're seeing tonight, I think, is a big deal. This is, I think, but I call it a city opportunity to really help the port and the community, protect and nurture a really valuable community asset, this deep water terminal facility and some of the related transportation and industrial lands are really awfully important to the city and to the community, to the region, really. And I think some of the details are in the background in the element, if you've read some of those. But that number of $22 billion in recent export value of the cargo going across the dock is pretty astounding for a relatively small facility as port facilities go, because I've worked on a lot of them around the region. But this one is special. So again, it's a very unique and valuable community asset. I guess that's one thing I just want to keep impressing on people. It is that rare combination of navigable deep water, rail, industrial rail line access, direct access to interstate highways, and other support infrastructure by the city and the community. And so I think it's really critical. I think the GMA took a while for the Growth Management Act to finally catch up, but did finally say, yeah, this is really important. Obviously, Seattle and Tacoma are super important port facilities, but Everett's really not that far behind in terms of dollar value. And so it does give the city and the port the chance to harmonize their plans, to make them work even more effectively together to do the best for protecting the community, of course, but also allowing this important facility to maintain its operational abilities and to grow as appropriate, to expand and take advantage of new opportunities in the marketplace. And also, it really helps the city implement two really important Growth Management Act requirements that have been in place for a while that apply to ports, and particularly this port, which is it's designated not only as an essential public facility, it's also designated as a transportation facility of statewide importance. And so there's a lot of meat on the bones of those requirements, and so it helps the city and the port work more effectively together to make it work right for everybody. But the last thing I wanted to say is it's also a bit of a mindset adjustment for the community, I think for some of the surrounding landowners and for developers, and Mary's doing a good job of it, I think, pointing out some of this already. But I don't want you to underestimate how important this is, and it could get just a little bit tricky along the way, so I'm trying to prepare you for that. And of course, it gave me a little bit of a flashback when I started preparing to just make a couple of comments to you tonight. And back in my county planning days, I had the opportunity that was a real bucking bronco. I helped supervise a lot of the growth management planning for the unincorporated area of the county. And one of the biggest challenges we had, of course, were protecting hundreds of thousands of acres of resource lands. And that was forestry, minerals, and agriculture, of course. And to try to find out which ones are the ones to save and designate and protect the most. And of course, the goal was to protect them from incompatible land use activity around them, and also to educate the community as to their value. And of course, I was aided one of my able lieutenants as your planning commission chair right up here, and so she knows this story too pretty well. And it was up and down for a while, but I think actually it was a lot of the other counties were going through the same experience, but I think in the end it really turned out amazingly well. That was a big sea change for everybody to recognize that, well, when that farmer starts up his tractor at 4 in the morning or spreads some fertilizer on his land, and even though you live right nearby and you really don't like it, well, that's the way it works now, because the farms are so important to our community and to our economy and to the environment that it has to be that way. And the same thing when they log property nearby or excavate minerals. And so some the landowners nearby aren't going to be thrilled. And of course, the idea of putting a notice on your property title really upset some folks. But I think it's sort of settled down, and people kind of take it for granted now that that's important. It gives the landowners understanding when they buy property and sell property, and buyers and developers the knowledge that there's something really important nearby that has some rights that have to be respected. So, and these other measures that Mary mentioned too are all part of that package. So it is a kind of a switch around, because we're used to trying to do everything to protect our most sensitive land uses, and they still have to be protected. But these other uses, though, have a certain standing that's now got the stature of real Growth Management Act protection behind them, but we're trying to do it in the most appropriate way for everyone's best interest. So that's basically my takeaway message, that I think this will be a great thing for the community, but there could be a few things that will take getting used to by everybody. So If you have any other questions for me, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll just step back and let you deliberate here.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. So I guess I'll look at my fellow commissioners and see if somebody wants to start with comments on the draft that we have before us. Commissioner Adams?
I just have a quick question, probably for the port. I appreciate all the detail, and I think it's a good draft and good work. I see the numbers with regard to the direct and indirect jobs. How many jobs are actually on site within this planning area?
If you're setting aside the longshore activity, the longshore are, of course, a separate union from what the port has under its wing. I would estimate, like port-wide, there are probably 100 employees. That involves marina operations, marine terminal operations, and administration. But then, in addition to that, there are, well, I guess that's the hardcore number roughly. But then we also have how all of that, how the port supports all of the other industries like the trucking, the shipping companies that need to be supplied that call on our facility. So it branches out from there. And I'm not sure that was your question, but because the figure of the 35,000 plus jobs, of course, that relates to the aerospace industry that we directly support by virtue of the Boeing cargo that comes in to our facility and then gets railed up to the Painfield area. So sometimes it's hard to separate those numbers. So while there may not be a large port employee base on the property, it's the support, it's the role that we play that creates the opportunities to support all of the other industries that go into that larger number.
Other comments? Commissioner Sand?
Thank you. I echo the comment about the draft. I thought it was really well done and very interesting. And the number I was impressed by was the nearly $100 million in taxes to local government. I think that's really a significant number. I had a question about the Kimberly-Clark property and whether or not that is actually in the Marine Port core area, or is it outside?
I'll make sure that, Mary will make sure that I say this right. It's outside the area that we're referring to tonight. The port core area would be our deep water marine terminals and Mount Baker Terminal. If you're referring to the central waterfront plan, which is, I think, essentially the Kimberly-Clark property, I think, Mary, you've been careful to make sure that that is outside of the boundary of our core area.
And the reason I was asking is I noticed that there's a policy statement in here that, and I think you mentioned it, Mary, that talks about Kimberly-Clark property adhering to the
Yes.
Central Waterfront Plan, and I just wondered why it was even in
Well, there's
this
also
document.
policy in there that talks about encouraging aggregation or
Right.
acquiring more properties, and that's probably the most likely property or some properties in those areas to potentially be acquired, but, and it does allow container shipping and the outdoor storage related to container shipping and stuff. We could separate that out, but I guess we wanted to make it clear that if they did acquire that property,
It would
you know,
be-
they still have to comply with that. Those policies would still be in effect versus the policies in this document.
So there'd be essentially a dual layer of policies?
Unless we ended up revising one or the
Oh,
other
okay.
after property acquisition.
Okay. And then the other question I had was about public access and whether or not there can be a stronger policy statement in here about encouraging public access as this core area is redeveloped.
I don't know, Mary, I'll take a shot, see if this flies with you and Dave, but the port is record and has a track record with regard to supporting the City of Everett's shoreline public access plan. Where we cannot do on-site public access due to activity, water-dependent activity or safety issues, we wind up looking at that menu of projects that is included in the City of Everett shoreline public access plan and sort of picking one of those that we can support with, in most cases, like a cash contribution. And that's in the case of a water-dependent activity, preventing like a shoreline trail from occurring, that kind of a thing. Certainly, the port understands the requirement for public access, and the commission itself, the Port Commission itself, has a 2% for public access policy, which kind of goes hand in glove with a shoreline permit requirement for providing public access. And we've got, again, a track record of being successful with contributing funds to those projects which have been identified. So the short answer, I guess, is that we understand that there is an important role that we play in carrying out the city shoreline public access plan.
And from my perspective, I think there's a greater benefit to have multiple locations for access as opposed to one or two. And I don't know how we achieve that. And I understand the complications and the conflicts between public access and this type of activity that would occur in this area. But I think this should be a goal that we should look towards in some fashion.
Okay, we can take a look at that again, and have more discussion with the port on that. We did put some stronger language in the central waterfront plan, but it still comes down to if there's conflicts between like a heavy manufacturing type use,
Right.
there may have, off-site public access may have to be provided.
Yeah, I think we just
And-
want to do the best we can.
Okay,
Yeah.
we can take a look at that again.
Nice document. Nice document.
And we can, maybe it's a good time to bring you up to date on what the city's been doing related to public access and the closure of Bond Street there. The BNSF has come in and wants to replace the bridge that's on Lower Hewitt there, just west of the Anchor Tavern and where the road ends there, Hewitt. So they submitted a plan. We issued a SEPA document, environmental review, that required some improvements in that area, including a view platform, but also a public access replacement for Bond Street, which the railroad shut down, because you used to be able to walk under Bond Street, under the railroad track, and then across the railroad tracks at Bond Street. The city had an opportunity for a period of time to put in a public access there, and that expired. So part of our interest was to have public access that would go across there. Now, it's very complicated to do that because of the number of railroad tracks and then where it can land on the other side on port property or right-of-way and such. So there's a desire to do that, and by the city, and those conditions were put on there. That project, it goes to the 120-day review. That's been on hold while we wait for Burlington Northern to respond. There was a meeting with planning staff, our attorneys. I think they had an attorney there too, and talked about that. We asked for more information, so we're asking for that information. But one of the things that is happening in the sense of you have the lower track and the upper track. The upper track is the one that goes through the tunnel downtown. The lower track is the one that goes along what would be east of Kimberly Clark and then up and around. There were some private easements across for Kimberly Clark, and there's also a public road bed at Kimberly Clark, a public road across there. And BNSF, there's a process by where you can abandon those, and since Kimberly-Clark is no longer there, the railroad also would like to do away with those crossings, the private one that Kimberly-Clark had, and also the public one too. And so we've been working on that also. So the goal, and we're trying to get information, is the need there, because the railroad wants longer trains to be able to be parked there. And we had a lot of complaints at that location because the railroad would park the trains there, and there was crossing arms and lights that would ring, and they would just go on forever. So people who were just right up in hill would hear that, especially in the summertime with windows open for air, they would go on for hours. And so we're trying to work with the railroad to get access across the railroad tracks there, and also help and have them pay for improvements that would get people across that would be safe. And so we're working on that. That would get it across, and that would get it then down to the beach that's down further to the south, or I guess it's to the east, west. But anyway, and also what we're seeing is, because there's, a lot of people are using that on a daily basis, and because they're not using it as much, we're finding we're having more, it's a place for more homeless and such to hang out, because there's not as many people who are using it. So it's becoming a place where people, go across the railroad tracks and such. So it's a issue that we need to work on and make sure that we continue to have good public access in the area and people go down there. I know when I used it, the trail there was always somebody else on the trail. Raining, cloudy, whatever, there was always people on that trail, different times of the day. So, every time I ever walked it, I always passed somebody down there, or numerous people. So it was a well-used trail. So,
Commissioner?
Yeah, I was just surprised to hear noise mentioned as part of the discussion in relation to the port, because I've never really heard that the port, I know that there's noise generated by port operations, but you've got the railroad, and you've got so many other things going on, and then the port's kind of always been there. I know that would be some noise generated by the port operations, but it would be very intermittent, and plus you've got the Navy, and you've got Navy ships coming and going. So I would, and if they're gonna develop down there, at the waterfront, and they know, it's kind of a reality of developers that are starting to build their houses a little more soundproof, but I haven't heard people complain about the port much for noise. Railroads, yes. Port, no.
Yeah, so we did meet with the port and discuss some of the noise complaints they had, and they're not consistent noise complaints, but they happen more frequently when they're doing nighttime operations, or there was during that slowdown in the economy, it was pretty quiet down there, but they really started having a lot more activity and have started getting more noise complaints. And there may probably been people buying houses when it was quieter, and now it's getting noisier, and so it is an issue for some people, at least. And the city doesn't get as many, although we did get one like the week after we met with the port on the issue. We did receive a noise complaint, so, but it's not real frequent.
Okay, thank you.
Regarding potential compatibility issues, one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I don't think it's really mentioned in the policies, would be lighting, light and glare, because the port loading and offloading facilities, I'm sure they have lots of security lighting, as well as, you mentioned, nighttime operations. So that might be something you might want to address in a policy.
Okay, we can take a look at that.
And same thing, and then this might get more into the regulations, which would come later, but emissions and odors, too, could be something that you might want to address.
Okay.
One other comment that I wanted to pick up on was the policy related to collaboration, and just reading the draft element and realizing how important the Mount Baker terminal is. And just thinking with the ferry terminal being moved closer to that area, if maybe in collaboration, there should be some mention of the Washington State Ferries, the city of Mukilteo, and the Tulalip tribes also.
Okay.
And then I noticed on page 18, the policy, transportation policy, heavy haul routes. There's italics at the end of that mentioning bridge clearance. I wasn't sure if there was supposed to be another sentence there or not.
I'm waiting for response back from our traffic folks on that. I wasn't quite sure what it meant, so.
So I guess the other topic that I thought was interesting was thinking about, so on page 9, the Marine Terminals Master Plan that was last updated in 2008. And I was just wondering if there would be portions of that that might need to be revised based on this new element in the city's comprehensive plan, sort of how that was going to fit together. And then also looking at that figure on page 9, figure 3, that shows the proposed expansion, which looks like it's more over water, and the much larger, longer and wider ships that could be coming in, and just sort of anticipating if there should be some mention in policy language here about that. And those were my comments. Any other comments from the commission?
Just to kind of piggyback on those comments you mentioned, I think the traffic, another thing about the industrial use, it tends to generate less traffic than commercial and high-density residential use. So actually keeping it industrial, although you do have truck traffic that's going to go between, the port and the freeway, and it would impact probably Pacific Avenue to some extent, or I guess it's now that going to go up to 41st. I guess that's the plan. Actually, you're going to have less, if you just, the aggregate, impact is going to be greater, or it's actually going to be less from an industrial use. Although they want to increase the capacity and the volume of trucks going to and from, but I would be interested in knowing how the numbers really, how they come out on that, because it seems that maintaining an industrial use will keep that traffic volume lower, sort of as a total impact, or so it would seem.
Look into that also.
And probably one of the complications is the type of items that come in, because obviously the Boeing parts come in and they're taken off by a barge, come in by boat and then to a barge. And then some of the other things are put onto rail cars and moved out by rail. So it is a multimodal, so not everything that comes in there goes in and out by truck. It also goes by rail, so.
Okay, if the commission doesn't have any other questions or comments, this is an opportunity for any member of the public who would like to approach the podium. Please fill out the half sheet for our records, but now's an opportunity to comment on the marine port element. Okay, doesn't look like we have any comments on that at this time. So thank you very much to the port for coming in and helping answer questions tonight. So now we'll turn attention to the draft of the critical areas regulation update.
Okay, with this element, we are proposing additional amendments to the land use element of the comprehensive plan, as well as the critical area regulations. The land use element has a pretty large section on critical area policies in there. The review and analysis of the critical area regulations is required to be done as part of this comprehensive update of the comprehensive plan. And this update is only going to apply to areas that are outside of shoreline jurisdiction. We'll be required to update our shoreline master program 2018-2019 timeframe, and in that timeframe we'll look at properties in shoreline jurisdiction. There's some overlap with frequently flooded areas in shoreline jurisdiction, and we have to cover frequently flooded areas in here, so that's my only caveat to applying outside shoreline jurisdiction. So what are critical areas? They're wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, and those are the streams, the Snohomish River, the areas that provide habitat for priority and endangered species. Frequently flooded areas, which include the hunter-deer floodplains and the floodway areas, and then geologically hazardous areas, which are erosion areas, landslide hazards, liquefaction zones. GMA requires that we use best available science in regulating critical areas. The staff report includes a list of all the science documents that we used in our 2006 update. So what we're looking at now is new information since 2006. The Department of Ecology was nice enough to provide all the cities a guidance document that addressed updates related to wetlands and frequently flooded areas. I've also reviewed the court cases and Growth Hearings Board rulings since 2006, and there wasn't anything really significant in those related to Everett's critical areas. And Snohomish County right now is doing for their critical area regulation update, is doing a more comprehensive, best available science literature review, and they have their scientists in the Surface Water Management Division doing that. It's supposed to be available this month, but my hope is to be able to review that document and make sure that there's no new science related to Everett that we need to incorporate. From talking to Snohomish County staff, it sounds like there really has not been a lot of significant new scientific information related to these areas since 2006. If we can use that Snohomish County's addendum, then that's going to be great for us, and then we'll circulate whatever we do to, excuse me, the agencies that have expertise in these issues, Fish and Wildlife and Department of Ecology and others. So the ecology guidance for wetlands. They came up with a new wetland rating system for Western Washington that became effective in January. For state regulations, for local governments, we're supposed to update as part of this comp plan update. Excuse me. There's still 4 categories of wetlands, but they reduced the point spread significantly. And to better reflect the scientific accuracy, the wider point spread, they felt made it look like there's a lot more precision in the science than there actually is, so they've reduced it down. And there's more emphasis in the rating system on where wetlands are in the landscape. So isolated wetlands would get a lower score than, say, a similar wetland that was located next to Lake Sammamish or something would receive a higher score because it has more opportunity to provide higher functions. So after revising this, Ecology looked over a large number of wetlands in western Washington to compare how they changed ratings under the new rating system. So 60 of those sites remain unchanged. 30 sites had a lower wetland category and 21 sites had a higher wetland category. And those categories relate to what your wetland buffers are. So the individual ratings may change, and thus the buffers that apply may be affected. But overall, the range of widths and that Ecology has recommended has stayed the same. So they still kind of go from the same low to high number. And Ecology actually provided for our specific regulations, gave us the numbers on how we need to change these to reflect the new rating systems. So instead of like the lower functioning wetlands, if they were 19 or less for habitat function, now it's less than 3 instead of 19 points. So our buffers are, Ecology in their best available science gave a couple different ways that you could establish what buffers were for wetlands. We used a system that most cities use, or a lot of cities, that's based on the habitat score. So in the wetland ratings, you'll get scores for different types of wetland functions. And we're using for the habitat function score to determine the buffer width. The top table here is what's in our current regulations. So category 1, 2, and 3 wetlands, with 19 to 36 points possible for habitat function, would have these different buffers in that second row ranging from 75 feet to 225 feet. And that the categories have been significantly shrunk, so the numbers only go from 4 to 9 points for habitat function. And they've eliminated a few of the in-between buffer widths. So you jump from 75 foot buffer to a 105-foot buffer, whereas in the other system there was a 90-foot buffer for somewhere in between. But overall, the range of buffer widths is the same. Ecology also provided recommendations related to wetland compensation. We have a table in the code that says if you're going to fill wetlands and you need to mitigate for those, you have some options. You can create new wetlands, you can enhance wetlands, you can do some combination, and then there's different mitigation ratios depending on the category of the wetland, the type of the wetland, and how you're mitigating. Ecology has come up with a new method for determining mitigation ratios, and it's in a document called Calculating Credits and Debits for Compensatory Mitigation in Wetlands of Western Washington. And so we've kept our table in there, but we put in a statement saying you can use this Ecology's new guidance in lieu of that table. So it just provides another option. And then we're also including a reference to new Ecology guidance on using a watershed approach when selecting a mitigation site if you're going to go off-site. And we've added So right now, our regulations include an option for people to mitigate in a mitigation bank. So a mitigation bank typically has a private sponsor, and they work with the federal and state agencies to come up with a plan for a wetland. They go out and construct it, and then after it's constructed, they can start selling credits in that. And so they're making a profit from operating this mitigation bank. So that's one method that's allowed. Ecology and the federal government have come, well, it's mainly the federal government, has come up with new rules for in lieu fee mitigation. And there's a new, the Corps has adopted standards, and then Ecology works with them on that. And basically what that is you have an agency sponsor or a nonprofit sponsor, and you come up with a plan for mitigating for wetlands that have been impacted. And you're allowed to start collecting money and giving developers the credit for mitigation before you construct the mitigation. And there's typically about a 3-year time frame where you can collect money before you have to construct the wetland. But that's all set out in the federal rules. So we added some language that allows that to happen. If, for example, there is some language in our ordinance right now that allows in lieu fee program if the city were to go out and develop a mitigation bank, or a program which is pretty unlikely considering the city's current financing. And so and that was only for smaller, like Category 4 wetlands. So we took that language out and then provided the option for someone to use this in lieu fee mitigation if it's available, and it would be for any type of project, not just the smaller projects. So it's just providing more flexibility in looking at wetland compensation. So the staff report on the floodplain maps was a little vague because we were still trying to get information, and I got my final email right before 5 today, so this presentation doesn't reflect it, but there were 2,000, our current adopted FEMA maps, the flood insurance rate maps, were adopted in 2005. And then in 2010, FEMA issued new floodplain map series, but they've never adopted them. And the Ecology's guidance for these critical area regulations updates state that they consider those 2010 maps to be best available science. But so that jurisdictions can adopt the 2010 maps and their regulations, but if you do, you have to use them in combination with the 2005 maps and use the most conservative figure. So if the 2010 maps, which are considered to be more accurate, take an area out of the floodplain, but the 2005 map shows it in, you have to consider it in. So you just take the worst case. And the 2010 maps, in many cases, they are a lot more accurate. They're digital data now. They have a more accurate vertical datum from survey data. They have more accurate contours. They used LiDAR data where it was available and they're on aerial photos, so they're a lot easier to use because you can see on the ground where you are better, and the old maps are really difficult to read at times. One problem with the new maps is that over the years we've had a lot of properties that have been filled, and there's a process that FEMA has called a letter of map revision, where if you fill the property and you document that it's elevated out of the floodplain, survey it, you can take that to FEMA and they can issue a letter of map revision that says, okay, this area is no longer in the floodplain. Well, the 2010 maps don't reflect any of those fills that have occurred, so they still show they're all in the floodplain. So if we know about them, we can we don't have to regulate them as being in the floodplain, but it's just really confusing.
And just an editorial note is that when we get the information, it's not in map form, it's in a legal form. So you have a legal description of a parcel.
It's very,
And so, you have to have somebody sit down with a map and figure out where that is on a map. So they don't make it easy in sense of providing a legal description and a map for that legal description, so.
So there are a few areas, where the new maps are kind of confusing. There are some polygons, ecology staff pointed out, that aren't closed, and some areas look like they should be in the floodplain and aren't. In some places, the floodplain's been reduced. In some cases, it's been increased. One of our biggest issues regarding the 2010 maps is that we have what's called a rural flood fringe district along Larimer Road. And in that rural flood fringe district, you're allowed to do a lot more fill than you can in the adjacent zone. And I'll show you that later. And that would allow more people to build homes. There's possibility we had when we did the Marshland Sub-Area Plan, EIS. They estimated that you could maybe get 12 homes in that area along Larimer Road.
Excuse me, Chair Stewart?
Yes.
Just a
Commissioner?
quick question. Wasn't the flood of, was it 2007, where they had a big flood and it went over the I-5 down in Chehalis? Didn't that actually, you were mentioning the old maps and the new maps, the 2010 maps, didn't the flood elevation get actually higher with the new maps?
I don't think they did in Everett.
Not in Everett?
No, the one thing that makes that really confusing is when they changed the datum for the topographic elevation that changes, there's like in Everett, there's like a 3.7 foot difference between the old datum and the new datum. And so it looked like all the floodplain elevations went up, but it was just because that survey datum changed.
Never mind, I
So
was just curious.
it's really confusing. So this is an example of the 2005 versus 2010 maps. The colored in areas are what's shown on the 2010 maps, and the 2005, the red lines are on the 2005 maps. And what this is an area that's kind of at the top of Everett going around. So the blue area on the left is the light blue area is the Riverside Industrial Park. You got the Snohomish River, and then on the other side of that you have, Lowell or Langus Park and the wastewater treatment plant area. So here's an example. This is Langus Park. This is part of where the wastewater treatment plant expansion is. This is Riverside Industrial Park. And so like in here, there's it's pretty minor changes. And, this blue area is a new area that's in, but it kind of wobbles in and out down here. This is interesting because in the 2010 map, it shows Langus Park is not in the floodplain, but in the 2005 series, it is. This is where they're doing the wastewater treatment plant expansion. In the 2010 series, it has more areas in the floodplain. This continues further south, so this is going around the River Point area of Everett. Again, here's a wastewater treatment plant property and where the expansion's occurring now. This is the main branch of the river. This is, I think, Union Slough going up here. This is areas where some of the biggest changes have occurred. So the 2010 maps originally showed this whole area, the River Point, as now being in the floodplain where it was not in the 2005 maps. Since then, the city owns this property that's in white. Since the 2010 maps were issued, I think in 2011 or 2012, the city filled this property to make it be above the floodplain, and they went and got a letter and map revision from FEMA. So this is a change to the map shown by our Public Works Department. It's not really on the, it's not, the 2010 maps show it as still being in the floodplain. I've lost my arrow. There. This area down in here, it shows more area at the northern part that's in the floodplain now in 2010, but there was a much larger area down here in the red, with that red outline in 2005, so it's more convoluted and kind of hard to follow, but less area in the floodplain down in here. This is the area along Larimer Road that I was talking about. On the left is a 2005 map, and the city limit line runs north and south here, east and west here. Most of the marshland area is designated special development area, and that allowed up to 2 feet or 3 feet of fill in that area. And FEMA mapped that and modeled it because at one point in time the city had planned to do ball fields and stuff like that, and they wanted to be able to go in and level out playing fields for ball fields. And we had, I'm sorry. Here it is. We had this area along the road between this line here and the road that was that rural flood fringe district. But on the 2010 maps, that rural flood fringe district disappeared, and they moved the special development area all the way over to the edge of the 100-year floodplain. So that would eliminate the potential for people to be able to build those homes in that area, because in order to build a house, you have to have it be 2 feet above the 100-year flood elevation, according to Everett's regulations. And 3 feet of fill is not going to be enough for anybody to get a large enough structure to be able to do that. So the email I got right before I came over here was that they think these maps were amended again in 2011, and there were 3 panels that were changed to fix this issue. So we may have a rural flood fringe district on the preliminary maps, but I haven't opened the files yet. So basically our options are to use the 2005 maps, which are the adopted maps. They're the ones that are on FEMA's website. They're the ones that the insurance agents and a lot of the people go to determine if properties are in the floodplain. And talking with the Department of Ecology's staff, their floodplain staff at the Northwest Region office, they said they're not going to push us to use the 2010 maps because they think it's really confusing to have to try and use both sets of maps. And they have concerns about a couple of the panels where they thought there was missing polygons that weren't enclosed. And they just think it's going to be confusing to use both sets of maps. And I would say our land use staff agrees with that at this point. But the other options we could do is use our GIS mapping and try and figure out, the most conservative of those 2 maps and put that on our zoning layer somehow. So if we wanted to, if there were a few areas where we wanted to make sure we had pretty conservative regulations, we could do that. And we could also do that, but just avoid those areas where the 2010 maps are really confusing, or areas where ecology pointed out some issues. So at this point, we're leaving our options open still, and to have some more discussions about how we want to proceed on this. And if anyone has preferences, that would be great to hear. This comes out of another ecology recommendation. Is there was a lawsuit between the National Wildlife Federation against FEMA for how FEMA was implementing its National Flood Insurance Program, saying that the National Wildlife Federation was saying they felt that what does it say? That it was bad for endangered species. And as a result of that lawsuit, National Marine Fisheries Service the court ruled that yes, that was the case, and that they were having effects on the critical habitats of these endangered species. And there's more species than just the local ones that we have here, but there's other parts of the Puget Sound where other species were affected. But National Marine Fisheries issued a biological opinion that identified actions that FEMA needed to take to bring the National Flood Insurance Program into compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So locally, the species that were affected were Chinook salmon, Puget Sound steelhead, and southern resident killer whales. So FEMA and the 122 communities in Puget Sound were given until September 2011 to comply with this biological opinion. And in July of 2011, Everett submitted information showing how our existing regulations and planning director interpretations complied. So our submittal included 2 planning director interpretations, one that was from 2000 and then an updated one from 2011 that directly addressed issues in the biological opinion that showed how we were going to use our critical area provisions to meet those standards, including, how when we require habitat assessments and habitat management plans for these species, for development in areas that could impact these species, what procedures we were going to use and the criteria. And those are in the packet you got, I think attachments 1 and 2. So Ecology's guidance recommended that, all these jurisdictions have these policies they've adopted, and they need to reference them in their ordinances so the public and all the staff and everyone knows that they're out there, and just to make them more available. So we've included some background information similar to what's in your staff report. We're proposing to put that in the land use element appendix. And we had moved a lot of the background information from critical areas into an appendix, and so this would be added to that background information. And then we would reference those PDIs in the land use element of the comp plan and both the critical area regulations and the frequently flooded area regulations. And we updated some language in the code and the habitat assessment section to reflect the distances from streams and floodplains that those if development's within a certain distance of those streams and floodplains, they're required to do those habitat assessments. So we put those distances from the biological opinion in the ordinance. And I think this is lastly, Ecology guidance also stated that jurisdictions may want to cover sea level rise in their frequently flooded area provisions and other impacts of climate change, like, extreme storm events, if those needed to be addressed in critical area regulations. And we looked at that, and in the past, what we've done is used our SEPA authority to require analysis of sea level rise and other impacts for projects that come in near floodplains or near shoreline areas. And so, for example, the riverfront redevelopment and in their EIS, they did an analysis, hydrologic analysis of impacts of sea level rise as projected in the latest reports for their location upriver, which is different from what will happen at the port's property down along the bay. So the port also did an analysis for the waterfront place to look at impacts for that development to see how high their main elevation was going to be. We've also used SEPA jointly with the city and county on a couple of projects on the Smith Island restoration project that's been in the news a lot. That's a joint city-county project, mostly county. Their EIS looked at sea level rise impacts. And then there's projects going on along the bay or proposed within the next year or so, like at Howarth Park to do beach nourishment out there. And like a few other areas along the bay between Mukilteo and Everett to do some beach nourishment. And they looked at sea level rise as part of those projects also. And ecology has provided guidance on how to use SEPA in these to address these issues, and that was attachment 5 in your staff report. So at this time, we're proposing, instead of putting anything in the critical area regulations related to this, is to continue to use our SEPA authority to address the impacts of climate change and appropriate mitigation. And those are the primary things. There's some other minor amendments in there. So I think I hit the big ones.
So Mary, I was looking at, in the packet, attachment 3, which is a letter from FEMA that seems to be saying that the city's regulations are compliant with the biological opinion. So isn't that really key that that FEMA has concurred that?
That is key, and that includes those 2 PDIs are part of those regulations. And then the other part of the letter that's key is if we change any of those policies or regulations, we have to notify them so they can make another determination to see if we still comply or not.
So does that mean the proposed change, so are there enough changes that you do have to go back to FEMA?
I don't think so, because I think what we're doing is we're just referencing those PDIs in our regulations and in the comp plan and the information we've already given FEMA. So we just want to make sure everybody knows they're there.
Okay. Any questions, comments? Commissioner Adams?
Good job. This takes a lot of time and detail. I'm impressed listening to you go through it. I have a couple questions, and I think there might be a couple typos on the wetland rating, starting on page 3. And if I read this correctly, so category 1 is 23 points and more. And then going on to page 4, a wetland 2 classification is 19 to 21 points. Should it be 19 to 22 points?
Yeah, one of them's wrong.
And then down below that, the category 3 is 16 to 19, but 19 includes both category 3 and 4, so I think one of those, they just overlap a little bit there.
Okay, thank you. And 9 to 15, okay.
And then in your presentation, moving down to the bottom of page 4, with regard to the buffers, you talked about less than 3 points being one classification, but the wording actually has been crossed off the less than portion of it. Is it just 3 points for the buffer rating there, or is it less than 3 points?
I think you can't get less.
Can't get less,
than-
okay.
Less than 3.
That makes sense.
That was how I interpreted it. I'll check that again.
And that's fine, I just wanted to
confirm.
make sure that.
My impression was you couldn't get less than 3. And we're probably not going to have any Category 1 wetlands that are 3 points, but we added that in just in case some fluke happened.
All right, yeah. I appreciate your presentation on that. I understand it much better, actually, after you going through it. And then on page 20, this is the sea level rise and extreme weather events. You may understand the numbering, but I don't in terms of the first part is 3, and then the flood risk reduction is number 4, and then I couldn't tie that into other sections before it. So I just wanted to note that I wasn't sure if that got copied over from something else that.
So, so 2 was on page 12, so 2.
Way up there, okay.
So 2 started the discussion of the National Marine Fisheries biological opinion, and then all the amendments or related to that biological opinion are between pages 13 and 19.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. And then on the policies, this is just a clarification. Should the policies then be 3? Those tie in somewhere else that I don't understand, I'm sure.
Policies
but-
are in the climate change and sustainability
Okay, that
element.
makes sense. That's where you're pulling them from. Okay, thank you.
I could have indented them or something.
Oh, no. I wanted to make sure that that was correct. So good job. Thank you for the presentation.
Any other comments? Commissioner Sand?
I'd like to go back to the question on the letter from FEMA. If the city were to make the revisions proposed and not submit them to FEMA for their review and approval, what's the consequence if FEMA later finds out that they have some concerns with the change? I wouldn't imagine they would, because it seems like the standard's being brought up to current.
Well, we go through an audit with FEMA. I don't remember if it's every year, every 2 years or something, where they come in and look at every permit that we've done that's in
Oh, really? Okay.
that's in the floodplain areas. And if we are liable if we haven't implemented the program correctly. And that's gotten into some concern, like the PDI requires compensatory storage for developments. If you're above a certain, in the lower sections of the river, in a flooding event, the area is already going to be flooded by a high tide, so storage isn't going to be an issue. But if you're upriver a ways and you fill, you're taking up storage capacity that may impact the endangered species. And so our policy requires these developers to, if you're going to fill, you have to provide compensatory storage somewhere else. And so, so that's been a concern of planning staff and making sure how we're going to implement that to make sure the city is not going to end up being responsible after an audit for the city going out to find some storage somewhere. So we are liable.
That's why I was wondering if it wouldn't make sense to actually submit this to FEMA to get their concurrence with it, as opposed to exposing the city or private development to a challenge later on. So.
We will circulate to FEMA.
But FEMA, and since their time frame is, I don't know, we looked at it, it took us a year to get that letter after we submitted our stuff.
No, it took almost 3 years.
Oh, okay. A long time. So they're not real quick in their responses. But from an administrative standpoint, we do consult with them. We don't do things unilaterally. And I'll give an example. There's an area where it's below floodplain level, but it has fill around it that's above floodplain. So they're saying we really shouldn't have to do compensation, for storage because we're behind an area that, it won't flood because of that. So we got a map from an engineer and a statement from that property owner, and we're going to FEMA with it and saying, do you concur with the conclusion? So, when we do these things, we're always consulting back and not independently, studying it, and they're willing to look at stuff like that, so.
Other questions, comments? Commissioner Holland?
Thanks. I'm just curious, you brought up the differences in the floodplain maps, and I'm curious if there's been any residents in the city who've run into problems with FEMA as far as now being put into a floodplain where they have existing residences and things like that. We've experienced that in Marysville quite a bit, and we run into a problem where most of the times it's elderly folks getting told that they got to have flood insurance now and this and that, and they got to go do the map corrections, and it's quite expensive really for those to do that. I was just wondering if GIS division or anyone has worked, and we've been working for 5 years to try to get these areas corrected and things like that and continue to map when there is map corrections, but has there been much complaint, I guess, to the city that why is this happening to me? And
We don't have many residences that got moved into the floodplain. In fact, there may be one or two that are out along Railway Avenue, like on that River Point area, or just south of the River Point area, but and those are mainly, I think, used for commercial type uses right now, and a lot of them are like boating operations or maintenance, something related to boating activities out there. So that hasn't been an issue.
good.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm familiar with a property owner who, who's out in the county, and in the 2005, they weren't in 2010, they are in, and for them to go through the whole effort, they'd have to survey and everything else, and this isn't an elderly person, but, but that person hasn't been willing to do it, and the county has accepted the 2010 maps as best available in science, so if you're in that area, you have to follow. They've accepted the 2010, so which has taken up areas. We haven't seen the same thing because the area that Mary's talking about, there's some people who live there, but those areas have been flooded, and most of the living is above a workshop. There's places where boats are brought up and they work on them or make them, and then they live on the second floor above. And so when it starts flooding, they move their tools and everything up to the second floor, and the bottom floods, and when it goes down, they go back to work. So we haven't had the same issues that what you're talking about. So, and the letter of map revisions. One of the things on FEMA that I thought I'd point out is we're trying to see, just for public, is because of letters of map revisions, you show people floodplains, and they're looking at a project, and you say, well, this project's in the floodplain, and we said, well, yeah, that's what the map shows, but there's been a letter of map revision, so it's not in the floodplain. So we're trying to figure out what to do, or at least put a note that this part of this area has been removed through a letter of map revision, and having that on a map so that people go, and then we can have those on a file, and if somebody wants to explore it more. Anyway, but it's the whole FEMA and map stuff. If you worked at it at all, it's and you have it's pretty confusing, and it's for planners, and it's real confusing for the public. So anyway, and the only place that we've had interest is along that Low Malarial Road, which Mary had touched. There are people who are farmers out there, or people, because there's ownership on both sides of the road there. So uphill, people have property, and then they have property on the riverside, and they might say, well, I'd like to sell that off and build another house there or something. And so, as Mary mentioned, that was looked at as a part of the marshland study, and it's limited. It's 12 houses, but still, to the people who own the land, that's important. So we've tried to work with them on that, and we have people come in and talk about it, but then they don't necessarily come in. And also in the past, there's a little bit area in Lowell where we've actually, when people have wanted to subdivide property and add on and stuff, we've actually required them to make sure, to survey the area that's outside the floodplain and the area that's in the floodplain, and that's part of that subdivision or short plat, and so that way they know what is buildable and not, so we do that right up front. So that's happened in the low area, so we haven't had people who have built in the floodplain and then find out they're in it later, so.
I have one.
Yes, Commissioner?
I'm just kind of trying to sort this out a little bit. FEMA is generally concerned with disaster assistance and flooding, and, and they are making a comment in their letter about the biological opinion, and they were being sued by, what was it, the fisheries?
National Wildlife
Or
Federation.
National Wildlife, and because they felt that the sort of the environmental aspect of it was being somewhat undermined, or is that?
That it
kind of-
was causing impacts to listed species. And for an example, they were saying, well, the floodplain regulations, which allow you to develop in floodplains and require you to fill if you're going to develop. I mean, they basically say if you're going to develop, you have to fill. You're eliminating floodplain that's valuable habitat for endangered
Right.
species. And you're encouraging that by
You could almost buy your way into, well.
yeah, and
this
if you
is-
want to get out of having flood insurance, you have to fill, and so it's really encouraging people to
So I've kind of seen
eliminate floodplain area.
the two there's two issues that are kind of being muddled together, but, the one thing they both have in common is the flow of water, so the reason I'm asking is that it would appear that we have as a resource the Department of Ecology, and I don't know, do they sort of advise us on any of this stuff? I know that, we can say, yeah, we use our SEPA authority to protect, bull trout or, steelhead salmon or sockeye salmon or whatever. But so we are the authority, we make sure that all those sort of biological environments and processes and, that the protections are in place to protect, all those little environments that need to be in place for the fish to go upstream and spawn and do all that kind of stuff. So I'm just kind of, can you sort of just, sort of an overview, sort of sorted it out? How do we ensure that we're in compliance with FEMA, but FEMA's, they're concerned with floods. But
Well,
they're
now
not
they're
so
con-
concerned with
Now they're
fish.
concerned with, because of the lawsuit
Because
and
they have to,
the
right?
decision, the biological opinion, they're required to make sure that their program doesn't impact endangered species. And we're required under the Growth Management Act to protect critical areas and to have no net loss of function
Okay.
of critical areas. So
So FEMA is.
and to use best available science, which is
Yeah.
part of that, that biological, and we have to if we want to participate in the flood insurance program, we have to have a floodplain regulations that are consistent with FEMA's regulations.
Uh-huh. So
So
FEMA
it's-
they have to do the analysis of the environmental review and, have like a biologist has to look at it and say, yeah, that meets the criteria for, that meets the criteria for this lawsuit that, they were forced to sort of comply with?
Right, we submitted to FEMA a big packet of all the city regulations relating to grading, road maintenance, stormwater management, our critical area regulations. I know there were a lot more in there, the laws about water quality and industrial pollution, all that kind of stuff. And we had to show that those regulations were consistent with a big checklist of items that were in the FEMA biological opinion. So we had to go through item by item through there and show how our current city regulations, along with these PDIs that we added, or the one planning director interpretation, met every aspect of that biological opinion. So we had to meet that in order for them to issue this letter that said we complied, and that went through the, a bunch of scientists that, from National Marine Fisheries, working with the FEMA scientist. So.
When you said scientist, I'll buy that. All right.
Well, the cities, when, the endangered, salmon were listed endangered species and such, the cities, responded because of the potential of being liable. And so that's where the city has changed practices, and our Public Works Department was one of the leads on how do you respond to that, because it had to deal with, like, when you sweep up, a street, what do you do with the material that you swept up from the street, and what chemicals you use and all that. So all that stuff was looked at, and the city had to change practices. So we were, not doing things that would be harmful to salmon. And the port has the same type of things too, that they have to make sure so they don't get sued by someone for, not using best available practices in science. So. But what we're doing here is not really changing the course, but trying to update the FEMA, and we aren't ready to make a recommendation related to 2005 or 2010, so we have maps until we have all the information. And so that, when we make a recommendation, it's based on some good information, and it's coming in as we're working on this. So.
Well, they seem kind of, in some senses, they are connected, but in others, they seem very different sort of issues that you're dealing with. One is flooding, and the other is, the environment.
Well, and it's different thing. I mean, Snohomish County has made a decision to use 2010, which means you have to use 2010 and 2005. And using 2010 maps as best available science. Ecology is saying we're not going to, push you in that direction, because when we're done and this passes here and goes on to City Council, it also gets reviewed by the state, and since the critical areas ordinance, or they'll comment on it, and so we always work with the agencies that will be reviewing these things to make sure that we're not. We're in the ballpark for what they're going to require, so.
I guess I had a quick question regarding the timing, just because it seems as though there's late arriving information and we're still waiting for some information from others. Are you trying to meet some state-imposed deadline to get this done, or?
The deadline is the same as for the comp plan update, and we're probably going to be slightly late because of the transportation modeling information, and we need to have that before we can do the EIS. We're going to try and prepare all the EIS except for that, but we may not get that for at least another month or so, I think longer. So we'll end up probably missing the deadline a little bit, but, other people like Snohomish County have missed it in the past by much longer than what we're expecting to miss it by, and hopefully there won't be any implications from that. The other thing I should mention too is I met with our land use staff today. I asked them a long time ago for feedback, and I finally got an email yesterday saying, oh, we want to talk to you about some more changes. So hopefully they're going to be minor changes and just clarifications and stuff, but I'm not sure to the extent of what they're asking for at this time. I don't think they are either, so there may be a few more changes coming.
Okay.
There's no penalty if we don't meet the deadline. There is long-term, there are grants and such that the state has, or money coming from the states, it says, are you in compliance with GMA when you apply for those things? But since the state doesn't really have that much money, or hasn't had, that hasn't been a big issue. So, anyway, so at this point, because it used to be, if you go after a planning grant from the state, they want to know if you're consistent with GMA. Well, we're not getting any more planning grants from the state, so it's not.
Yeah, just the small cities
Yeah,
can
some of the
apply for
small
those,
cities,
yeah.
Right,
yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so
Okay.
we're going to keep working along and do it as quickly as we can, and balancing with other things like the port project that we had that went through and such. So we continue to balance things, but we'll continue to work on it and.
Okay, I can just sympathize with staff trying to get enough comments so that then you're ready to bring it forward to us. So we'll probably see another version of this, I guess, before it's ready for city
Yes.
council, so.
Yeah.
Before we leave this item, though, I did want to give a chance if there's any public in the audience who would like to speak about the critical area policies and regulations update. Seeing none, then I guess we've completed our agenda for tonight. Any comments from staff, or I guess we'll see you next Tuesday? Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thank you.